Yes. Good afternoon, and thank you, Nick.
Next up is Sabrina Burris, Special Assistant to the President for Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Access at the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles County and the La Brea Tar Pits and Museum. Sabrina.
Good afternoon.
And last but not least is Dr. Maurice Baynard, Vice President of Community Learning and Chief Diversity Officer at the Academy of Natural Sciences at Drexel University.
Thanks so much, Nick. Good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you're at.
Yeah, and so we'll start off with just a few questions that I'll ask our panelists, and then we'll have time for audience questions that you can drop into the chat. But first, many people get into museum careers through different pathways. I started at the museum as a college intern doing tours. Sean, you were president of Kenyon College. Maurice, you have been in academia for a long time. And Sabrina, you were at Howard University, at UCLA, at Berkeley. So I just wanted to ask each of you, what made you get into museum work and why is this work important for you? We can start with Maurice.
Nick, I think I probably have the most circuitous path, so I'm glad to go first. As you said, I fell in love with science at an early age, and I had the real pleasure of both studying science and then doing science literally in labs with white coats, and then teaching science for a really long time. But later in my career, just in trying to support students of color, I got into sort of university leadership work, which got me into DEI work. And it was that path that brought me to an outside advisory panel here at the Academy. And so my first work here at the Academy was just really thinking about how we could be a more inclusive organization, how we could tell different stories and find new audiences. And as I learned more about what the Academy's mission was, the more I realized that it was a real calling. It was something that I really wanted to be part of, not just in an advisory function, but as sort of a life's call. And then here I am. So they threw out a call, I raised my hand and was lucky enough to be chosen to be a partner.
Thank you. Sabrina, Sean.
I can chime in. So in many ways, I think I have actually quite a bit in common with Maurice's path. I was a kid who loved science early on. I was one of those kids who did a lot of after school and weekend and summer programs. My mom signed me up for every possible activity that we could find that was science connected, including at our local natural history museum in Cleveland, where I grew up. And then I started a career. I studied chemistry in college, eventually went to graduate school, and became a professor. I sort of went through the professor track at small liberal arts colleges, and gradually drifted to administration, mainly because I was drawn to teaching and research because of the connection I could have with students and the impact on students, and realizing that in administrative roles I could have both broader and deeper impact on the whole student learning experience. And then sort of eventually took on the role of president of a college, Kenyon College, when I was sort of called about the opportunity at AMNH. What attracted me was that it would bring me closer to science again. And after a long time in college administration, I had moved away from having science as a central part of the work that I did, but would also deeply connect me to education in terms of the not only formal education, but a broader public outreach piece. And what really excited me was that potential to have an impact on a large number of people from a really vibrant and diverse city. And so it's been 6 months, but it's been a good 6 months.
And we're happy to have you. Sabrina, what about you?
So it's interesting hearing both of you speak, because I think the thing that we all share in common is this pathway of education. So I would say for me, my path was really started with my parents, as cliche as they may sound. My mother is a scientist. My father, when he was living, was a history teacher. So living with them was sort of a liberal arts college, a mini liberal arts college, really exploring culture. And that led me to Hampton University, which is known as the first fine arts museum for African American work. And so that experience really, as a person who came, I guess should say, who is from the Central Valley in Bakersfield, going to that museum really opened my eyes as it related to the African diaspora. And so I had a chance while I was at Hampton to work as an intern through my amazing family connected me to an African American gallery. So I started working with public programs and then moved into higher education work, eventually working more closely with administration through philanthropy. And what it really showcased to me was that while we were really focused on opening pathways for BIPOC communities into higher ed, there were really some opportunities to think about what it means to look at the trajectory of learning at all ages. And so I was really drawn to an opportunity to come to the Natural History Museum about 6 years ago, thinking about what would it look like to really inspire youth in K through 12 and not just focus so heavily on higher education. And so that's what really led me here. And I'm happy to be here and really happy to hear more about this organization.
Thank you. And Sean, I wanted to ask you, AMNH is in New York City. It's one of the most diverse cities in the world. How has AMNH engaged that diversity and that diverse community? And what more can be done at AMNH to, increase Black engagement at the museum?
I think that at the core of AMNH's engagement with diverse communities from New York in general, and I think the Black communities in New York in particular, has been through its education programs. And this takes place on a range of different levels. We have a program, several programs that are aimed at supporting teachers in the New York City schools, a program for accrediting teachers or folks who are interested in teaching middle school with a master's in teaching and MAT degree, which you can obtain at the museum. Those graduates get placed into New York City middle schools that serve high need communities. We have a program for high school students interested in science research that's targeted at students who are underrepresented in sciences or historically excluded from the sciences, that brings in high school students from across the city for intensive research, internship, and mentoring at the museum and projects at the museum. And we have a range of different field trip programs and projects with the schools, including a program, Urban Advantage, which connects the cultural institutions of New York that are geared towards the sciences with middle school and elementary schools throughout the city. In all of that, I'd say one thing that's been interesting to me, and I hope we can do more of, is thinking not just how we connect with students through one-off field trips or in informal ways, but how do we deepen some of the engagements with students and actually their families. And I think the work that folks in the education department do to try to bring in families into the science education work, to make sure that students who participate in these programs have invitations to their families to come to the museum as well, are all efforts to make the museum a welcoming place and to cultivate a sense of belonging for young people to come to the museum. That said, just one thing I wanted to touch on, though, is that I think there's more us to do museum is how do we also bring the museum more actively into communities across the city, sort of building partnerships with community-based organizations where we can reach neighborhoods that are not as familiar with the museum, that may actually have transportation barriers to get to the museum, to reach families who might not have the time to make the trip across the city to the museum, and bring some connections to science into those communities as well, which I think will also help us to strengthen some of the bridges and connections to Black communities within the city. And one final thing, which I think is just an interesting area for us to explore, is how we also think about our exhibition program. Really important to the Black community and other diverse communities in New York that can be reflected through some of our permanent and temporary, deep and ongoing, and the broader outreach into the community and the exhibition work are things that I hope we can bring to the museum and the coming.
I feel like that's a perfect segue. Maurice, I know the Academy of Natural Sciences, you guys have community engagement and community science initiatives. So can you tell us a little bit about, what does that look like in Philly at the Academy?
Right. So I think the real key is getting outside the walls of the building, right? So community exists broadly everywhere, and it's really about where you draw the lines around us and them. And so I think in institutions, there tends to be this expectation that if we build it, they will come. And I don't think that model has worked for a very long time. And so partly it's showing up where people are. How do you find folks? Where are they gathered and what are they interested in? So we do a lot of going to where communities are gathered and building relationships with people who are already organizing and wanting to do things in the natural world. So I think that's one. Two is learning to move at the speed of relationships, and then rather than the speed of, say, grant deadlines. So a lot of times when we build programs, we have a lot of requirements. We got to get this done. It's got to be done within this fiscal year. We got to get this money out the door. And that's not really how organic relationships work in the real world. And one of the things as we started doing community science, literally participatory action research focused on not just research for the Academy where we all get to write both our grants and our papers and make CVs longer, but can we do research with communities, not just using human beings as data collectors, but being in conversation about what the problem is, what our approach is going to be, and how then can we take what we learn and give it back to you such that you can change your life or make something better, even if it's not the thing that we want to emphasize. We learned that takes a long time. And you might have a grant to do something that you want to do in a place in the city. And that grant might be 2 years, but the relationship takes 4 years. And I think it's about figuring out how you stay engaged, stay involved, and stay in relationship, even beyond, what is paid for. And so those are like our broad ways of engagement. I think that's super important. I mean, I will say, like, lastly, I think it's also about telling an open and honest truth about what has gone before, what things haven't worked in the past, what ways we haven't been inclusive in the past. And by telling those truths, people understand that you're being honest about your new direction. And so for us, it's not about shying away from difficult topics or bad stories. It's about expanding a conversation and telling more nuanced stories about how science has shown up in communities, how it's being used to keep people out and exclude people, and the way in which we now want to utilize this science to kind of bring people in to build a bigger boat.
Thanks. I definitely want to follow back on that, about the truth and the being honest about the past. And so, but first I wanted to ask Sabrina, LA has a really large Black and Latinx population. It's a really large city with, lots of suburbs and people spread out all over the place. How has the museum worked to bring those particular audiences into the fold and make them feel welcome in the space?
That's a great question. As you know, or anyone who's traveled to LA knows that there are various ecosystems and you can spend your life in the car. So we try as much as we can to bring people outside of our four walls, or I would say that one of our main themes is to be a museum of foreign with Los Angeles. And so I'd really like to shout out our education and programs team, as well as research and collections, because both of those teams have made a concerted effort to get out into the community. And so whether that's through our community engagement program, which really serves to not only look at schools, but to really form important engagement with communities that maybe haven't historically felt part of natural history museums, and really offer them space within our museums. But additionally, it's everything that Sean also mentioned. It's having school and teacher programs. One of our largest groups that comes to the museum is LAUSD, which is the second largest school district. So it's really important that we create spaces that not only are welcoming, but allow those students to see themselves. And so it's really critical to have amazing partners within our museum that really focus on creating content that is inclusive. And as Maurice mentioned, it's not so much not telling stories that are uncomfortable, but ensuring that the voices are included. Historically, as you know, within museums, our voices haven't always been centered. And so through having staff that are thinking about how can we retell these stories, it also provides the community with an opportunity to see themselves in ways that they wouldn't have in past experiences.
Yeah, I think that's really important and sort of goes to my next question, which tied back into what Maurice was talking about being open and honest about the past. And, natural history museums in particular are collections-based institutions. And so the collections are really important in the stories that natural history museums tell. But at the same time, they have a really complicated and long history. In a lot of ways, it's hurtful for communities of color to sort of engage with some of those collections. And so what have your institutions done to sort of acknowledge or address that history? And I know, Sean, there was a New York Times article recently about AM&H. And so I just wanted to see if you wanted to talk about that a little bit.
Sure. And I think that it's impossible for us to build inclusive and just institutions unless we both acknowledge what's happened in the past and take steps to repair and heal damage to communities and ruptured relationships with communities, and do work to restoration as much as possible. I also think that I agree completely with Maurice that this is work that requires true partnership and collaboration. There's the acknowledgement piece that has to be done by the institutions, but the determining what's needed to repair and heal and kind of lead to sort of a restorative justice model of improving the relationship actually requires listening and working along with communities and building a sense of a network of trust with communities to do that. And so it's a process that takes time and care. We've started some of this work, or at least this work had been ongoing at AMNH for some time, but just in the recent months, we've decided to take some initial steps around our human remains, ancestral remains collection at the museum. And probably the most important things to recognize about that collection and that collection practice is that with a very few exceptions of individuals who donated their bodies for research, none of the individuals whose remains ended up in the museum did so voluntarily with willful consent. That, again, for the most part, these were people who were from groups who had been exploited and subject to racism or colonialism or the sort of socioeconomically disadvantaged within the local regional community, and basically dehumanized by the process of not only by larger social processes, but then the museum's contribution to the dehumanization over time in the way that some of these remains have been displayed in exhibits at the museum. So we've made the decision to change our exhibition policy, to remove items from exhibit, to create some processes which will allow us to accelerate the return of remains to origin, to descendant communities, and to really sort of do some further work that's not only public acknowledgement, but a broader education work about understanding how the museum arrived at this point, and working with partners to figure out what the most productive path is for the museum moving forward. I think this is critical to do, especially for Black communities. And it is, certainly won't be surprising to folks on this call that among the individuals in our collection include skeletons from formerly enslaved individuals from New York City and the surrounding region, other Black and Brown people whose bodies had ended up at medical schools for anatomy research and education, and then eventually ended up at the museum. There's a lot of work to do to both uncover and be very clear and transparent about our collection practices in the past, be very clear and transparent about how we're going to work towards return and restoration, and use this as a moment to build a better, just future by acknowledging what's happened in the past.
Thank you. That's really important. Maurice and Sabrina, anything that you wanted to mention about your institutions?
Sabrina, you want to go?
Sure. So the thing that comes to mind is really that our institution, like other institutions, has really been on a journey, I should say. So our leadership came to NHM in 2016. So in that time period, really thinking about what it means to be a museum with Los Angeles, it really started with creating a community engagement focus and ensuring that we were looking at our external community and finding ways to bring them in. But as we started to go into that process, we were also at a point of social reckoning within this country. So around the time that George Floyd was murdered, the institution really leaned on its staff and allowed staff to create what we call our IDEA framework. It's a transformational framework that really is how we are choosing to address past harms and how we are really looking at our museum and the history of colonization throughout museum culture as a way to really address and co-create as we continue to work with our community so that people feel seen, represented, and heard. And so it's really inspiring that the institution allowed the staff to really be the voice and center the areas that they thought should be a focus. And so in doing so, we've really been able to build upon our work with the Native American community. We now have a council that's really focused on how do we co-create and address issues that have happened in the past, as well as creating a policy last year that really addresses human remains. So we've been really taking actionable steps as it relates to what our history has been and what we aspire it to be, and really understanding that we need the community's input on that as to what's important to them, but there are actionable steps that we can take to also change the path of museums, and we are committed to that work.
So I really appreciate, Sabrina, it being sort of a journey. And I think that's the apt metaphor, right? We don't even know where we're going, but we know that we're trying to move forward. And sometimes it's sort of a messy process. And so I'm thinking about three big things that the Academy has done within the last couple of years that I think are really crucial in thinking through what is in our galleries, what is on our walls, who are we in the world, and how do we show up, and how does that impact other people? So the ones that really jump out at me is we just closed an exhibit called Illuminating Birds, which was all about bird illustration throughout American history. And that's a pretty easy exhibit for us because we house John J. Audubon's elephant folio. And if you're a bird person, you know that John J. Audubon is the father of American bird illustration, and venerated. So the national organization for birding is the Audubon Society. And we used to really hold Audubon and his works up as sort of the pinnacle. I mean, we're talking about a person in a white glove with a white glove who every hour on the hour would turn one page of this really large book. And that was at the center of this story about who he was. But scholarship and understanding sort of American history and telling a more accurate telling led us to understand, like, that guy was not a great guy. And not the kind of person that we want to stand in front of kids and hold up as a hero. So I think the knee-jerk reaction would simply be, oh, let's take the Audubon and put it in one of our drawers and never bring it out again. But that's just a knee-jerk reaction. That doesn't create conversation. That doesn't create learning. And so what we did, which I think was new for the Academy, was embark on a series of conversations. Conversations with regard to DEI, with regard to who would be harmed, conversations of why do we have this thing? What is the meaning of this object? What has it meant in our past? And how do we want to frame it today? And in the end, we brought out the Audubon, but with a much more nuanced story. You can't see it, but I tried to, the wall hanging that hung over it is here in my office. And it's all about this complex, nuanced, and difficult story that Audubon is. And we haven't finished with that story, right? And so this object, as it relates to the man, as it relates to the world and how we see it in the world we want, is not about making people heroes or even tearing those heroes down. It's about telling a more honest and more complete story and making people part of the conversation. The other thing is we house the Lewis and Clark herbarium, those plants that were gathered by Lewis and Clark when they moved across the country. And so we were actively involved in a project called Recollecting Lewis and Clark, which is all about partnering with Native peoples who, at the time of Lewis and Clark's expedition, were intimately involved in their understanding of what those plant species were and what those plant species did. They just ended up erased from history. And so we find that this is an opportunity to partner with Native peoples and Native knowledge and build a more expansive, nuanced, and inclusive story about this thing that's been here for 200 years, right? And so I think that's the journey that we're on. We're just at the beginning. And I think we want to do more and more of it, look for more and more opportunities to make more layered stories.
Yeah, I think that brings up sort of, for me, like the contributions of Black and Indigenous folks to our scientific understanding, right? And oftentimes those folks aren't talked about, in who helped Darwin sort of understand the land and the ecology of the islands, right? Like, you know, sort of those individuals are never really spoken about, but we always hold up sort of that sort of Western white individual as this is the person who discovered or created, you know, a particular idea. And I just wanted to ask one more question before we jump to the audience. So if you have questions, feel free to send them to the chat monitors, because we'll get to those questions in just a moment. But I just wanted to ask finally about sort of staffing at your institutions, and sort of, you know, we talk about young people, you know, being the next generation, and sort of them needing to see people who look like them in science and doing the work that we want them to sort of go into in the future. So how does the staffing at your institutions reflect the diversity within your cities? And how do you sort of approach diversity gaps in your staff? Whoever wants to start, feel free.
So I'll start with this one. Going back to the framework that I mentioned, one of the goals was to really not make that just words or performative, but to really in action be a museum that was a forum with Los Angeles and really uplift marginalized communities. And so in doing so, what we really made as one of our key initiatives was to enhance new hire diversity. And so for us, what that meant is, knowing that Los Angeles is this highly diverse place, we felt like our museum should also reflect that. So our goal initially was to look at the various demographics in Los Angeles and mirror that. And so in a year's time, we've taken our internships from 13% African American or Black participation to 31%. So we're really proud of the fact that by making concerted efforts to engage the youth, that we've really seen growth not only for our internships, but also in our hiring practices. Our promotions this year were 60% BIPOC, or Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And so it really, I think, is important to not only speak about past harms, but to create a future together by really putting forth, institutional goals that mirror what you say you want to achieve. And if we want to really uplift Black and Latinx students, we have to create programs and also metrics that we are responsible for reaching in order to see that happen. So we've been really focused on that, and we've seen our workforce reflects the community now as a result of the staff really feeling empowered to put these metrics in place. And so I'm really looking forward to what we do next as it relates to, it's one thing to mirror your community, it's another to continue to empower it. And so I want us to continue in the ways that we're growing to really understand that there's just still so much more work we can do.
Sean, I'll jump in and say, I think you have to do many things all at once. So our Women's and Natural Sciences program, which focuses on girls from 9th to 12th grade and has a heavy dose of internships, is all about building the next generation of scientists and collection managers and the folks that will really do the work. So, but that's a long-term play. But what do you do right now? I think it's about looking really broadly across your institution and asking, what are the policies, what are the procedures, and what is the structure that has given us what it looks like? I mean, if you just look at the Academy's demographics, I mean, they don't really mirror the city that we're in. Philadelphia is the 6th largest city. I say that embarrassingly when people from New York and people from LA are on the call. It's the 6th largest city in America. It's majority minority, and it's also one of the poorest cities in the nation. And so I think it's easy to just throw up your hands and go, oh, we can't get diverse talent. Oh, there aren't people who are really qualified, or nobody's really interested in being in our museum or here at the Academy. But I think you have to really diversify. You have to ask yourself, where are we looking? Who are we talking to? What are the networks that we don't know, including this one, that might help us draw people to us, and really start to look a lot different than we have in the past. So like all of our institutions, we used to be really, really white and really, really male dominated. And I'm happy to say that we've spent a lot of time really thinking about that and trying our best to think about who we're recruiting, how we're hiring, and then how we're retaining people. And that means creating an environment where people want to stay. And so you have to be serious when people tell you that they're problems. When people go, I feel marginalized in this place. If you're not going to address it, they're going to go and you're going to end right back up where you started.
Yeah, that's really important. That, you know, that retention is really important and indicative of sort of the culture of an institution. Sean, anything you wanted to add before we jump to audience questions?
Yes, and I think that certainly as when I came to AMNH and taking a look at the diversity of our staff, it's an organization where we're far from reflective of the diversity of the city, and I think that a lot of work needs to be done. I think the area of science broadly, ranging from curators to folks not reflective of the diversity of the city, I think not reflective of where we want to be as an institution. And I agree with Maurice that I think they're both short-term plays and making sure that we communicate to young people that there are opportunities for them at places like museums. And I think many of the jobs, I think actually many of the cool jobs I've learned about since I've come to the museum, they're not things that I think even casual visitors or folks who come through on field trips know exist as jobs, right? That the folks who do the work in carrying and managing collections, or really understanding what a curator does, what the staff on a curatorial team does, on a research project does. And so the programs we have at AMNH, one of them is the MEEP program, and I have to apologize to Nick because I'm probably going to reverse the order of the two E's in MEEP of what they stand for, but the Museum Educator Experience Program, maybe.
You got it.
Museum
You got
Experience. Got it. Thank you. Is an example to give students like a year-long plus experiences in different aspects of the museum to understand how the museum works and to get an eye towards what types of positions and opportunities are available. And helping to make those more visible is important. I do think the short-term plays we need to make is just making sure that we have good policies in place for good, strong searches to generate diverse pools. I do think that there's talent out there. We just need to find it and bring it to the museum and support it so it can be successful, support the folks so they can be successful, and figuring out how to do that is something that I want to do or get moving here. There's one final piece, though, that I want to say that ties this back to the reckoning with the past. And it is, Nick, you referred to this a bit, that, all of us, all three of the panelists, we all talked about reckoning with the negative parts of the past. But I also think we need to do the work of bringing back into view the long history of contributions of Black people to the field of natural history, and that's important both because I think that's part of righting the wrong of the institution. They're figuring out where people have been erased from that history and making that visible again. But I also think it begins to change the narrative that it's not that we are inventing something when we're saying inventing something wholly new when we say that natural history museums are a place that should be welcoming for Black people. We are actually acknowledging this as the next phase of a long legacy of contributions of Black people to natural history. And it's a subtle but important pivot to make in telling that story, that it is not the case that it's new that natural history museums belong to all of us, but this is a field that's always had a place for us, if for those who've been able to make their way in. And I think the work of this organization and helping to tell those stories is incredibly important. And I think at all of our institutions, as we begin to peel away the layers, we find examples of critical contributions to the institution that would that actually have Black and brown people at their roots. And at AM&H, that includes critical contributions to the taxidermy of some of our most iconic dioramas. It includes the fact that some of our diorama murals were painted by Charles Alston, who was one of the great Harlem Renaissance painters who did work in the museum. That there are ways that I think making some of that more visible helps to reinforce the idea that it's not that it's new that we're here. There were always Blacks here, and we just need to claim that legacy.
Yeah, I think that that's really important. Highlighting those individuals who had contributions and the ways that they contributed, because we've always been here, like you've said. And so I just wanted to jump to some of the audience questions. One of the questions that came through was, what advice would you give to people who are looking to follow in similar career paths as you have? So anybody can answer that one.
I think it's important to look for opportunity, be bold, and leap. There was an article that I was talking with my wife about this week, and it was all about the fact that many people, when they see a job description or they see an opportunity, because they feel they don't match up with each and every requirement, they're dissuaded from applying. And that with women, that tendency is even higher than with men, which makes sense to me because men tend to run and leap without thinking. And I think it's important to be aspirational while grounded in reality. If you know where you want to go, I think it's super important that you find someone who's there or who understands how to get there to give you good advice. My my history of just looking at institutional leadership started when a president of a university said, I have an open door to policy, and anybody who wants to ask me to lunch, I will go. And I absolutely took that opportunity because I was really curious as to what it took to move into that position. And sort of the rest is almost history, because from that lunch, he knew who I was. He appointed me to some committees. He gave me some leadership. That leadership then led to even greater opportunities in administration. But it all started with taking the leap, taking the opportunity that he had given me, and actually just sitting down over sushi and asking him some real questions about what it takes to get there.
Sabrina or Sean, did you have anything to add to that?
I would say a quote that comes to mind is Toni Morrison, which is, the function of freedom is to free someone else. So I think about the fact that we've all had people who inspired us or who mentored us in this field. And so I think it's also partially our responsibility as leaders to reach back to people who maybe have interests. We all have at some point curiosity about something, and that's part of working in the Natural History Museum, is being open to curiosity. And so it's broadening people's perspectives of what it means to look at education. I think that when you think about the history of African Americans, there are a lot of folks who go the traditional path of higher education and teaching and other areas that don't necessarily see that as a way that they could transfer those skills to being a curator, to looking at research in a variety of areas. And so I think one of the commenters that's in the audience said something about it's not only being a welcoming place, but also a place that people can see themselves. And so part of it is having people like Sean and Maurice in positions that people see, but it's also about us just helping to expand people's understanding of what they can be, so that they know that you can be a scientist at any age and of any color.
And the only thing I would add to that is that I'm excited about the existence of this organization and the ability of this organization to be a network for mentoring, support, for asking questions, for that type of ability to get specific advice, guidance when needed, and specific direction when needed is incredibly powerful. And I certainly know that those of us who are in a position to give advice are more than happy and willing and excited to do so.
We have another question that's really about the sort of hiring practices and processes at museums. So the question says, the person has been involved in many hiring processes at museums where Black faculty is lacking. And despite having been very qualified or at times overqualified, they never get hired, because they often hear, we want the best, or they would be great at this other position because they're so overqualified. What advice would you give to someone who's sort of early in their career, sort of seeing that? How do you stay encouraged in ways when the system sometimes appears to be rigged against you?
Just want to acknowledge that that's a really hard question. And I don't think there's one catch-all answer. I also want to acknowledge that yeah, it's really difficult. People tend to hire this idea that they have in their minds. People like us, people who have the same passions, people who may have went to the same universities that I did, people that I see in my affinity groups. That one of the things that we're doing with groups like this is changing what people see. And I think the more people see that there are diverse candidates all over who might not look like what you expect, the more they give someone a chance. It's really a difficult question. And I think there are things that we can do. And one of those is, this doesn't answer their question, but at least institutionally, one of the things that we can do is at least to make sure that people are trained in what diverse hiring practices look like. Like, that's a must. That that long gone are the days of the person who created the job description, posted it, decided who all the finalists were, did all the interviewing, and then hired a person. No, like, that's not going to work, because all that will do is perpetuate an institution that just looks exactly like that. And so having practices, and I think it is going on, but we need a lot more of it, having institutions rooted and grounded in real equitable systems of hiring is super important. And if you're in a position to make that a thing where you are, that should be priority, thing one.
I can chime in, though I think less from the perspective of working at a museum, because I feel I only have 6 months of museum working experience to draw from. But my sense is that question is equally applicable or in the same context of the college, university, faculty hiring world, where I spent all of my life up until the past 6 months. So I can kind of answer it in that context. And I agree with Maurice 100% that the good practices and training and support for search committees on what a good search looks like is critical. I'd also say that it's important for the institution to not only put a priority about this on this in terms of policies, but to just talk about it openly. The uh, repetition and making it something that is heard and heard from leadership as being important again and again does help to move and change culture, right? And that reinforcing the message that this is an institutional priority is critical to do, and from as many different directions as possible. The last thing, and I think this also connects to something Maurice said, is that I have found that there are that some small things that departments can do can end up being really impactful. And this includes, and this is something which I think many people on this call can even do, is if you have an opportunity to invite a Black scientist to a seminar or talk at your institution, please do it at some point, right? And some of that, I think Maurice, you said that there are times when search committees will assert that they're not quite sure what a candidate that's a diverse candidate that's excellent looks like, right? And as annoying as that is, I think the way to counter that is to bring examples into the institution well before a search starts, to demonstrate that there are people out there. This is what they look like. Here's what the science looks like. That again, it's not something. It's not like everyone has the epiphany and their hearts and minds change instantly. But the more that message is reinforced, and the more the culture actually begins to accept that, yes, you have a panel, a seminar series of distinguished speakers, and they're going to include Black and brown scientists over the course of a year, and that's just the way the world is. It just begins to change the culture of that expectation of what scientific excellence should look like and what a pool should look like, that I think is helpful. So it's a small thing that I think people can really begin working on, and at any level in their institution.
Yeah, there's something that I heard that I sort of have internalized, and it's don't hire a culture fit, hire a culture add. Hire someone who's going to, bring something different to your organization. Hire someone who's going to think differently than you think, because that's going to make your work better, your organization better, and it's not about the person fitting in. It's about them adding something new to that space. And so I just wanted to invite Cheryl Lynn Leaf to come and unmute and ask her question. And that'll be our final question for the panel. If not, I can ask it. So Cheryl wrote, these museums have to not just be welcome to us, but advertise to us in a space where we can see and be affordable to us. How do we make more of us feel that we belong in spaces like this? And I think that that's a great way to sort of wrap up the evening.
Who's on the wall matters. So every opportunity, including Sean's recommendation of bringing in Black scientists, not just to give talks for the experts, but for the public. So who's on the wall, who's on the stage, all of that matters. And then this question of price barrier is real. Again, the poorest big city in America. The bottom line, it is, institutions run on money, but we've got to prioritize people over profit. And so we've got to put our money where our mouth is. And whatever we can do to lower the barrier of entry is going to be important. But I also think the model where we wait for people to come to us, that those days are over. And so we've got to show, the question isn't how do we get them in here, but how do we show up out there where they are taking our knowledge generation, taking our science, taking our great science stories and really fascinating people where they are, and then that will lead them back to us.
I would agree with Maurice. I think it's imperative that the images people see reflect them, but also in the telling of stories. So with the narratives that we have on the wall, not relying on past historical views, but incorporating other points of view that really allow people to see themselves is really critical. And outside of that, just thinking about access, that's something that our museum is always examining. And so we've tried our best to make our museums affordable by having after school hours. So every day from 3 to 5, ensuring that kids are able to get into our museums, and also that we have EBT access, because everyone understands that in terms of being in big cities, if you're under resourced, that's just another barrier in terms of your access to these spaces that we really want people to not only feel like they're welcome at, but that they feel empowered to one day lead. I'd have to say the best experience, honestly, working at the museum is seeing kids come in with their class and sort of pointing and realizing there are people in the museum that look like them. So I would just say to anyone that's on this call, I know there are days there's probably tough to be one of few if you are one of few in your institution, but just remember that we are in a unique position to really empower the next generation. As much as you can influence change from your seat, that you have a moral obligation to do so.
Thanks, Sean. Anything?
Yeah, the only thing I'd add to that, this is actually a callback to something that both Sabrina and Maurice said earlier, which is I do think museums have to go to the communities, to go to people where they are. Right? And that sometimes the best way to lower the barrier is to actually find as many ways to reach out directly to the communities and to begin the relationship there, with the idea that that can be a starting place for getting more knowledge about the museum that can help to bring folks in that way. So I think that's an important tool for us.
Thank you all so much. I just want to give Sean, Maurice, and Sabrina a round of applause. This was amazing. And anything that we want to say as we sort of wrap up the evening?
Nick, you've been a great moderator, so thanks so much for guiding us through this conversation about what are really, really important and critical questions to the future of natural history museums.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes, thank you, Nick.
Adania, anything that you want to say as we wrap up?
I can't believe you said Adania, but it's okay. Much
My
love.
bad.
It's okay. You did a wonderful job. So a couple of quick things. Thank you all for being here. I've realized I've slacked on my role of taking photos. So if I know it's evening, afternoon, really late, midnight for some of our folks, but if you are in a space where you're willing or able to share a camera, we're going to take a quick group photo. And while people are getting situated, and turn their cameras on if they want to, I'm going to say thank you to our panelists. It was amazing having you share your insights and knowledge and tips with us. And we look forward to growing with you as an organization. And thanks to Nick for moderating. Thanks to the whole Black Natural History Museum board and all its members, everyone for showing up here tonight or this morning or whatever time it is in your time zone. And thanks to Alnicia Blackwell. I want to give special thanks to her because we keep hearing the aspect of celebrating folks who have been gone unnamed and unrecognized. And that's the graphic designer who creates all of our graphics and created the graphics for our exhibit, which is currently at the Florida Museum of Natural History and will be a traveling exhibit thereafter. And Dr. J.C. Buckner, who's also a board member, and she started this whole history of Black people as part of our organization, which is on our website. And then Jessica Ware and Leanne Melbourne, who are both at the MNH, who worked with Alnicia in terms of creating that content. There's a lot of people to thank. Just want to thank them because we talk a lot about representation and having that matter. And we do have an exhibit live now. And so with that, I see some beautiful faces on the screen. So I'll give you a 3 count. So we're going in 1, 2, 3. Wait, I should probably look at the camera. I'm looking at you all. Well, let's do another 1. We'll do 2 more just to make sure. So here we go in 1, 2, 3. And let me just make sure there's nobody on the other slide. All right, so I'm doing the second side just to make sure. So I'll have to actually do 2 more just to make sure we get everybody. I'm sorry, y'all. This is how photography goes sometimes. And I'm not a professional photographer. So 3, 2, 1. All right, and last one. Flipping back the slide one more time. All right, last chance, whatever you need to do. We're going in 3, 2, 1. Awesome. Thank you, thank you, thank you. We have one more event tomorrow. I'll actually be giving a keynote and it'll be followed by a community conversation. And those are open to everybody. You don't have to be a Black member. We have somebody from our organization share about themselves or their work at the beginning, and we have Q&A, like a typical presentation. And then we have a section for our members, which is kind of a general body meeting. So please join us there and join us on social media. We are on multiple platforms. We're on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, Blue Sky, whatever there is, we're somewhere. So we're trying to meet you where you're at. So please join us, literally trying to meet you where you're at. And then we'll be on emails as well. We do have a way for members to sign up. So if you are a Black person working at traditional museums, please join our network. We share the list of people online. So we will be putting that link in the chat and we'll email you after this with that. If you're not a Black person and you're like, I want to help, I want to support, we also have space for you. We are creating a network of partners so you can join. We currently have volunteers who are working on organizing this and there's a lot more coming. So it's late. We had a wonderful night. I hope you all have a beautiful rest of your night. Again, panelists, this was amazing. I want to say lots of things, but I'm cognizant of time. So we'll follow up in email and on social media platforms. Take care, and I hope to see you all shortly. Goodbye.